Thank you. Derek Martin from the International Federation for Housing and Planning. I've got 2 points which I think I haven't heard much about. One, how do we finance or how do we finance these good projects, and how will we finance all the good intentions? And secondly, a bit linked to this, the employment of the aged. I think there's a whole army of people out there older than 65 who are desperate to work, and that will make them more inclusive. And I should point out, by the way, in a parallel session, one of the moderators is Sir Peter Hall, who's just turned 80, and you should see how productive he has been in the last 15 years. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this question is a rather popular question. The question is, this is all wonderful to create inclusive community, cities, so that people can live well throughout a life course and be inclusive of all ages, but how do we do it? I think probably Dr. Maliki had talked about this, I think the political will, but certainly from others, from Seattle, WHO, the Age-Friendly City initiatives, how do you actually make it happen? What does it take?
I would say that there never will be enough money in the world to do this as a standalone project or a standalone initiative. What we have to do is think more strategically about how to leverage investments across systems so that we're achieving these benefits. So the investments we're making in the transportation system, and the investments we're making in the park system, and the investments we're making in housing, all these different things where there isn't enough money either. But as you think about these things in combination, and you think about the play, as Emi talked about, what is it we're actually trying to achieve as society? You can find ways to leverage across systems those improvements that you might not be able to afford system by system. That's certainly what we advise our clients, is that same way with disaster adaptation and resilience. And you mentioned another thing that is part of this is doing these things sometimes has a very high labor cost that's associated with getting it done. The productive older adults certainly can be enlisted as part of the solutions to this. I mean, you get into all sorts of issues like labor rules and those sorts of things. But I've seen communities around the world where the designers have gotten out of the way, the older adults have taken it and run with it, and it's been the job of the government to sort of facilitate it rather than say they were in charge of it.
Mr. Ross, would you like to talk about from WHO's perspective?
Just very quickly, on the employment issue, in Japan right now there's a very active discussion from what's the role of the public policy to setting the retirement age, and this has implications for pensions and everything else. So one solution is the public policy and what the tone it's setting about expectations for employment. The second is about the value issue, is how we value the elderly, how they can work, and how companies treat that. It's a market as well as the employment, and it has to be encouraged. In Kobe, we have a Silver College, which is devoted totally to individuals who are above 60 years old. And so we see lots of examples about educational opportunities, which is not only about employment, but it's also cognitive function over time. And on the financing of projects, fundamentally, there is actually already a lot of money in the system because cities and communities have to provide for social services and health services for the elderly. The question is how to make that more efficient and be more creative with it. Beyond that, I'll leave that to the financiers and perhaps...
Right. I think for the employment issues, also perhaps legislation, because as Singapore is instituting, as of this year, legislation basically requiring companies to offer reemployment of older people upon their retirement at 62 at this moment. And I think there's similar legislation in Japan. So I think it's a combination of political will, recognizing that really you're going to run out of people to work if you don't offer employment to older people and make it appropriate for them, and as well as the private sector. I think another question here is really about, how can we really use IT to better integrate older people across within societies?
Okay, so like I said earlier on, I think first of all we need to focus on the people who need it, and like I said earlier on, healthcare is one huge area. Today, technology is really in place either for telemedicine in hospital acute care and step down community care and care at home as well. So that's a very straightforward, fairly straightforward in the healthcare area. In independent living, meaningful lifestyle, I would submit that continued employment, continued education, lifelong learning, they're all critical items which today, quite frankly, there's a technology in abundance to be deployed and to be harnessed across the industry.
It seems like there are a lot of technology available. We just have to think about where our older citizens need and want, and then deploy them appropriately, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would add that I think the right policies have to be in place, the right infrastructure. We're very fortunate in Singapore, the national broadband is in place. That kind of infrastructure has to be in place. The key question, again, is who pays and how should that be monetized? And then within the people community, accessibility, affordability becomes an issue. And last but not least, the corporations. Corporations must embrace the silver segment as a rich source of talents and not just an aging population. So all this in combination, and all this can be enabled by technology.
And that actually maybe a technological solution may also address this question, which is a very real one, where someone work with older people in the community, is that older people like to live at home, but older people also can sometimes become very isolated and extremely lonely. And of course, very lonely older people creates actually a very poor quality of life for them. And it's a terrible way to think they can lead your end of your life lonely and depressed. So how can an inclusive city design from urban planning and other perspective, technology and design, allow older people to live at home in a familiar environment and still not be lonely? I think this can apply to several speakers here.
Can I just give one example that ended up being a market-based solution as opposed to a public policy solution? One neighborhood in Seattle had two grocery stores that were competing against one another. And this was a diverse neighborhood, not racially, but in terms of gender preference and in terms of age. So they figured out that if they had older adults as the checkers during the day, that's when the older adults shopped. And they would bring this out, that the families shopped after work and the gay community shopped at night. So they changed who was at the counter depending upon what populations were coming in, and they saw themselves as part of the social network of the neighborhood.
That's wonderful.
I think if I just comment, I think isolation results from probably lack of connection and the establishment of social network the person has over time living in that area. And that's the point that I was alluding to earlier, that in order to ensure that our elderly age in place, it's just not about making them feel that they can have physical access to different places in the community, but also access to the people in the community. And that takes time. We need to try to facilitate relationship building between people. People who live in that particular unit, for example, they feel isolated because perhaps they're not connected with neighbors sufficiently. So do we encourage them to establish their own networks and facilitate that, or do we provide social programming that allows for that to happen? I think it has to be done at both levels. Some people are less comfortable going out on their own, but there ought to be active effort at the community level to try to connect people. And this takes time. Because it takes time, it cannot be done only when the person is old and lonely. It has to be done the moment the person moves into that neighborhood and be connected with that neighborhood. So this concept of micro-communities that I talk about is really when every member of that particular apartment block, for example, gets to know each other well enough such that when one elderly person does not come out when he usually comes out, then you know what's happened, or you want to be curious what's happened to that person. Why hasn't the person been going through the normal daily process or daily activity? So such connections are critical, and I think we have to continue to build in that importance of setting up the networks, enhancing that social capital that people can have through building those relationships.
Right. Actually, there are many, many good questions, but unfortunately, we have 20 seconds left. So unfortunately, as the moderator, I'll have to wrap up. I think just broadly looking at the questions, there are many questions about how to really create the environment where people connectedness will improve, and how can city planning or urban planning address that. But I would just like to say that if we look at all the comments from the 5 speakers, there is a central theme. Ultimately, whether or not it's creating a city whereby you have good housing, transportation, info communication, all that, even from WHO perspective, it's really ultimately about people. People's ability to have work, people's ability to access services and healthcare, people are able to be included socially and participate. And of course, across the board in terms of building homes, it's not about being super efficient, it's about having good homes that are endearing to the people in the community. And it's really not only about old people, really, in fact, about people of all ages. And frankly, when I had a baby with strollers, had 2 children quite close in age, I thought it was quite difficult to get around. And frankly, when the places become accessible to older people, it was also accessible to me and my kids. You know, so it's really not just for older people, it's for all ages. And I think there's an important point about creating a good city is not just about also meeting their mobility needs, but a city that encourages people to walk or to bike, or encourages people to lead a healthy lifestyle to allow them to age well as well. And finally, of course, to create this kind of a connectivity, we can look at not just about IT, which looks like there are many, many solutions, but ultimately it's about a physical environment that allows people to build communities and neighborhoods and connectedness between families and individuals. So I think it's a really huge issue, and there are a lot of good questions, but unfortunately the time doesn't allow us to give it due justice. So at this moment, I want to thank all of you and all our panel speakers and close this session.